Chapter 1. The Discovery. The blizzard had been raging for days. The sky, blanketed in a never-ending sheet of white, had swallowed the entire world whole, reducing the once vibrant planet to a ghostly pale expanse. The winds howled through the barren wasteland of the northern tundra, whipping up swirling clouds of snow that cut through flesh and bone with a bite so cold that even the seasoned explorers of the Tundra Coalition knew better than to venture out without the utmost caution. Few people ever made it this far into the uncharted regions of the planet, the great expanse of snow and ice that no one really understood. It was a place of silence and desolation, a place where the world seemed to have forgotten everything except the fierce, biting cold that ruled its terrain. Jacob and his team of scouts had been trekking through this wilderness for a week now, far beyond the established settlement zones, in search of something they hadn't yet found. They weren't looking for treasure, nor were they hunting for anything to claim as their own. No, they had come here in search of answers. The planet of Theron 3 was an oddity in the galaxy. Discovered centuries ago, it was far from an ordinary world. It was a world that had once seen the rise and fall of civilization's alien species who had come and gone, leaving behind remnants that no one quite understood. But there was something deeper buried beneath the snowdrifts, something that the Coalition believed held the key to unlocking a lost chapter of galactic history. If they could find it, they would unlock a wealth of knowledge, technology, and history that could change the course of their world and perhaps all of Theron 3's forgotten civilizations. That was the mission. That was the purpose of their journey. But the further they pushed into the wilderness, the more the tundra seemed to resist them, to fight back against their intrusion. The wind howled louder each day, the snow piled higher, and the land itself seemed to stretch out forever in every direction, impossible to navigate, impossible to understand. Jacob had been a scout long enough to know that he was facing something larger than he could have anticipated. It wasn't just the cold or the isolation that got to you out here. It was the uncertainty. There was a darkness that settled over the land, a weight that pressed down on everything. It wasn't just physical. It was psychological. Even the most experienced explorers began to feel it after a while, that creeping sense that you were being watched, that you were not alone. The ice-covered mountains rose up like jagged teeth in the distance, the blizzard blurring everything, leaving them blind to what might be lurking just out of sight. Every night felt longer, every step through the snow more treacherous. But Jacob and his team pressed on, driven by the knowledge that they were on the brink of a discovery that could define their lives. It was on the 4th night, with the winds howling and the temperature plummeting to levels Jacob hadn't thought possible, that they found her. They had been huddled together inside their makeshift camp, trying to keep warm by their small fire, the heat of which barely did anything to stave off the biting cold that was seeping into their bones. Jacob sat by the fire, his face drawn tight from exhaustion, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over him. There had been whispers among the crew, strange murmurs, the kind that came when a group had been isolated for too long, the kind that came when they started seeing things that weren't there. Jacob didn't believe in ghost stories, in the supernatural, but there was something out here. There was something that felt different, something beyond what they understood. And it wasn't just the planet. It was the snow. The endless expanse of white, stretching out in every direction, burying everything beneath its weight, making it feel as though they were buried in some forgotten, frozen tomb. But on that 4th night, something real happened. The blizzard had worsened, the snow swirling violently around their camp, when Jacob heard the faintest noise, something that didn't belong. He had been staring into the fire, his mind numbed by the cold, when a strange sound cut through the howling wind. It was so faint at first that he almost dismissed it. But then, it came again. A soft whimpering, the sound barely audible above the roar of the wind, but unmistakable. It was a cry. Jacob's instincts kicked in immediately, his hand reaching for the blaster at his side. The rest of the team was already on alert, their eyes wide, their hands gripping their weapons. They had been in hostile environments before, but this was something else. Something about the cry didn't sit right with him. Something about it didn't belong. He had no idea what they might be dealing with. "Stay sharp," Jacob whispered, his voice hoarse from the cold. He could barely hear himself over the wind, but he knew the others had heard it too. They all nodded, moving into formation. Jacob signaled to his second-in-command, Elias, to take the lead, and they slowly made their way through the snowdrifts, following the faint sounds that had brought them to the edge of a ridge. The wind was biting, stinging their faces, but Jacob forced himself to ignore the cold. His focus was on the sound. That whimpering cry. When they reached the edge of the ridge, they saw it. At first, Jacob thought it was a trick of the wind, some strange visual illusion, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw her half buried beneath the snow, a form so still that for a moment, he thought she might be dead. She was small, her body wrapped in something tattered and frayed, a cloak that had once been something more, but was now ripped and torn, frozen in the snow. Her face, pale and bloodied, was barely visible beneath the ice and snow, but there was no mistaking her features. She wasn't human. She had skin the color of pale, iridescent blue, shimmering under the snow and the dim light of their campfire. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were black like an endless void, giving nothing away but also showing everything. Her body was emaciated, her limbs thin and frail, as if she hadn't eaten for days, maybe longer. Jacob's first thought was that she was some kind of alien, but the second thought, the more pressing thought, was that she was alive. She was breathing, her chest rising and falling with the faintest of movements. Elias was the first to react, moving quickly toward her, kneeling down to check for signs of life. Jacob followed closely behind, his breath catching in his throat as he watched Elias carefully remove the snow that had buried her. His hands trembled slightly, but they moved with the efficiency of years of training. They had found something out here, something beyond the snow and the storms, and it was unlike anything they had expected. "She's still alive," Elias said quietly, his voice filled with awe. "Barely." Jacob knelt beside him, his eyes scanning the girl's form. She was small, fragile, but the signs of life were undeniable. The alien features she possessed were no longer important in that moment. What mattered was that she was breathing, that she was alive. But why had she been left out here? Why was she alone in the middle of a frozen wasteland? And how had she survived? There were so many questions that Jacob didn't have answers to, but there was one thing he knew. They couldn't leave her out here. Without a word, Jacob reached forward, gently scooping the girl into his arms, careful not to hurt her frail body. She was warm against him, despite the freezing temperatures. Her body seemed to have some unnatural warmth, a heat that Jacob couldn't explain, but he was grateful for it, as it kept him from feeling the full sting of the cold. "We need to get her back to camp," Jacob said urgently, his voice steady despite the rush of emotions he felt. "Now." Elias nodded, his face pale from the cold, but his eyes filled with determination. They moved quickly, Jacob carrying the girl through the snowdrifts back toward their camp, the rest of the team following behind them. Every step felt heavier, every gust of wind colder than the last. But the girl, whoever she was alive, and that was all that mattered. For now, the cold was an ever-present beast, creeping into every nook and cranny of the makeshift camp. The snow continued to fall, thick and heavy, swirling through the air in a blinding haze, drowning out everything except the howling winds. Jacob could feel the sting of the biting cold as it whipped across his face, but his focus remained solely on the alien girl in his arms. She had been unconscious for some time now, her fragile form warm in his arms despite the harshness of the environment. He didn't understand it, but as he held her closer to the warmth of the fire, he couldn't deny the fact that she seemed to radiate a heat of her own, one that wasn't just a result of the fire. It was as though she had her own energy, a warmth that seeped into his skin, giving him comfort, and he couldn't help but wonder just how long she had been out there. Her features, pale and delicate, were in stark contrast to the harshness of the planet's environment. The dark alien eyes that had first met his in fear and confusion were now closed, but there was a softness to her expression now that suggested a fragile peace. Her body, emaciated and weak, still shuddered with every breath, but there was a quiet serenity to her now. Jacob could feel the weight of responsibility pressed down on him, the feeling that he was no longer simply an observer of the world he had come to know so well, but a participant in something larger, something he couldn't even begin to comprehend. The team gathered around the fire, their faces drawn tight against the cold, each of them looking to Jacob for direction. They were soldiers, trained to navigate hostile environments, to survive in the harshest of conditions. Yet even they seemed to understand that this moment was different. They had found something here, something that defied everything they had known about the world and the universe. The girl, as fragile as she was, represented something more than just survival. She was a mystery, a question that hung in the air and refused to be answered. Jacob's heart beat steadily as he looked down at her, unsure of what to do next. All he knew was that he couldn't leave her alone. Not like this. Not after all she had been through. Jacob, Elias, his second in command, spoke up, breaking the silence that had settled over the group. His voice was low but urgent. "We need to get her warm. Whatever she is, she's still alive, and that's the most important thing right now. We need to stabilize her." Jacob nodded, his thoughts moving in the same direction. The fire wasn't enough. No amount of warmth from a small flame could undo the damage the girl had suffered. Her body was starved for sustenance, her skin drawn tight against her bones, and she had been exposed to the freezing temperatures for far too long. Jacob could feel her body shiver faintly as she lay in his arms, and the weight of her fragility made him uneasy. She was more than just an alien. She was a survivor, and he had to make sure she kept surviving. There was no room for error. "We'll need to get her inside the cabin, out of the wind," Jacob said, his voice steady, though his mind raced. "We'll set up a shelter around the fire. The cold is too much. We can't risk her slipping away." The team nodded, immediately springing into action. It was an unspoken understanding between them, no questions, no delays. They had a duty to this stranger, this alien, and they would do whatever was necessary to protect her. They quickly constructed a small makeshift shelter around the fire, insulating it with whatever materials they had. But Jacob knew that it wouldn't be enough. He could feel the cold creeping into his bones. And if they didn't get the girl proper care, she wouldn't last the night. With Elias's help, Jacob gently laid the girl down on the soft bedding they had prepared. Her breathing had become more steady, but the faint shudders that ran through her body still worried him. Her skin felt cold to the touch despite the warmth they had managed to gather around her, and Jacob could feel the life force of her heat slowly ebbing away. It was like watching a flame flicker on the verge of going out. He couldn't let it happen. He sat beside her, his fingers brushing against her delicate skin as he checked for any signs of injury. Her body was covered in bruises and scrapes, her clothes torn and ragged from the long days of travel. But it wasn't the physical damage that bothered him most, it was the way her body felt, the way her life seemed to hang in the balance with each breath she took. Jacob leaned forward, his brow furrowed, his thoughts racing. What had happened to her? Where had she come from? And why had she been left out here, abandoned in a place so inhospitable, so unforgiving? As the night drew on, Jacob refused to leave her side. He kept a steady watch over her, ensuring that the fire stayed strong, that the warmth continued to envelop her. Despite the exhaustion that weighed on him, he couldn't bring himself to sleep. The team had settled in around the fire, their faces illuminated by the faint orange glow of the flames, but Jacob stayed close to the girl, his focus entirely on her. He wasn't sure what he expected, but in his gut, he knew that there was something about her, something more than her alien physiology, more than her fragility that called to him. There was something important about her, something he couldn't place. Her breathing became deeper as the hours passed, and Jacob began to feel a quiet sense of hope stirring in him. Maybe she would survive this. Maybe, against all odds, she would make it through the night. But as dawn began to break over the horizon, casting its soft, pale light over the frozen landscape, the girl's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, Jacob thought it was just a trick of the light, but then he saw the faint glimmer of consciousness in her eyes. She was awake. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, there was silence. Jacob held his breath, unsure of what to say or do. She had been through so much. But there was a question in her gaze, a question that seemed to transcend the language barrier between them. She was scared, but there was something more in those eyes. Something that said she understood what he had done for her. She knew. And somehow, Jacob knew that she was more than just a survivor. She was something else entirely. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jacob said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. It seemed to be the only thing he could say. The girl's lips parted, but the words that followed came in a language Jacob couldn't understand. It was soft, melodic, and strange, but the tone, there was something urgent in it, something desperate. Her voice wavered as she repeated the same thing, the words unintelligible, but her eyes told him everything. "I don't understand," Jacob murmured, his throat tight. She lifted a shaky hand, and Jacob instinctively took it in his, the warmth from her skin beginning to seep into his fingertips. And for a moment, he thought she might collapse again, but then, her grip tightened, and she spoke once more. Please, help me. Jacob was no longer sure if the words were just in her language, or if the meaning had transcended the need for translation. But what was clear was this: whatever this alien girl was running from, whatever her presence meant, it was far bigger than they had anticipated. And Jacob knew that his life, and the lives of his crew, would never be the same again. Chapter 2. The Awakening. The girl's words had barely settled in Jacob's mind before he heard the unmistakable sound of an engine in the distance. It wasn't the usual hum of their own scout craft. This was a different kind of hum. It was lower, deeper, and far more mechanical. The sound sent a shock of adrenaline through his body, and he stood up quickly, pulling his jacket tighter around himself against the cold. His heart was racing. The girl had spoken, and she was asking for help. The question was, who was coming for her? Elias, Jacob called out, his voice urgent. He didn't need to look to know that Elias was already on his feet, hand on his rifle. Ready, Jacob, Elias said shortly, his breath forming in the cold air. What's happening? We've got incoming, Jacob said. Something's coming for her. The team moved quickly, setting up a defensive perimeter around the fire. Jacob didn't know who or what it was, but he knew they had little time. They had come here for survival, but now they were caught in something far bigger than any of them had expected. Something that might change the very course of their futures and perhaps the future of the entire galaxy. Jacob moved back to the girl's side, kneeling beside her as she struggled to sit up. Her eyes were wide with fear, and for the first time, Jacob saw what she was truly running from. It wasn't just the harsh wilderness. It wasn't just the cold. It was something far darker. We need to move, he said, his voice steady but firm. We can't stay here. Not with them coming. The girl's eyes flickered with understanding, her body trembling as she nodded weakly. She wasn't just a survivor. She was something else. And Jacob knew now that this wasn't just a rescue mission. It was the beginning of something far greater. With the storm outside still howling and the mysterious forces drawing closer, the stakes are raised. Jacob and his team must face whatever challenges lie ahead, all while trying to protect the alien girl, who may hold the key to something far bigger than they can comprehend. The battle for survival has only just begun. You said, continue Chapter 2, and then start Chapter 3. ChatGPT said. Chapter 2, The Awakening, continued. The wind howled louder as it whipped through the crevices of the cabin, making the walls groan in protest. Jacob's heart was pounding, his mind racing. The girl Lyra, she had finally spoken her name, was trembling, her frail body huddled beneath the blankets they had wrapped around her. Her silver-black eyes darted around, scanning their makeshift camp with an intensity that sent a chill down Jacob's spine. Despite the warmth of the fire, she looked vulnerable, fragile, a stark contrast to the fierce determination in her gaze. Whatever was coming for her, whatever had brought her to this frozen planet, was closing in, and Jacob felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. The sound of engines grew louder, closer, and Jacob knew that it wasn't a routine scout ship or an accidental landing. This was deliberate, purposeful, and it spelled danger. Lyra's presence here had never been a coincidence. She wasn't just lost or stranded. She was being hunted, and whatever had sent her to Earth, whatever she had survived, wasn't just a matter of simple survival. It was something much darker, something with far-reaching consequences. Jacob, Elias's voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. We need to move her. Now. Jacob nodded quickly, the urgency in Elias's voice matching the pounding in his chest. There was no time for explanations, no time to sit around and wait. He moved toward Lyra, crouching beside her, trying to keep his voice calm, though his heart was racing. Lyra, we need to move. You need to stay close to us. We're not safe here. She glanced up at him, and for a moment, her fears seemed to dissipate, replaced by that same quiet intensity that had been there when he first found her in the snow. Her gaze flickered briefly to the window, and Jacob followed her eyes, watching the dark silhouettes of the incoming ships in the distance, their engines cutting through the blizzard like harbingers of doom. They're here, she whispered, her voice quiet but filled with certainty. They found me. Jacob's gut twisted at her words. He had known something was coming, but to hear it from her, the person who had been running, hiding, surviving for so long, made it all the more real. This wasn't just a random encounter. The Zinther were here for her, and she had known they would be. But why? Without wasting another second, Jacob helped her to her feet, steadying her as she wavered for a moment, her legs shaky from exhaustion. She was stronger than she had been before, but Jacob could still feel the weakness in her body. They needed to get her inside the cabin, out of sight, and into the small underground shelter that was the only safe place they had left. Move, now, Elias urged again, already heading toward the door. Jacob turned to follow, but just as he reached the door, the sound of boots crunching in the snow outside reached his ears. The Zinther were closer than he had anticipated. They were already here. His pulse quickened as he motioned to Lyra and Elias. "We go now," he said, his voice a low growl of urgency. Elias wasted no time, heading out into the cold with Jacob and Lyra following close behind. The wind stung their faces as they moved, but Jacob didn't feel it. The adrenaline was pumping through his veins, his instincts now entirely focused on getting them out of sight. They had to reach the underground shelter, a series of old maintenance tunnels he had used in the past for just such emergencies. Jacob led the way, guiding Lyra through the snowstorm. The air was thick with the howling wind, but he didn't allow himself to think about the cold. He had to think about what came next. They needed to get to safety fast. But before they reached the hatch, a loud crack of a blaster echoed through the snow, followed by the unmistakable sound of a Zinther soldier's voice. "Move, now, or we'll open fire." Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He had barely turned in time to see a shadow moving toward them, cutting through the blizzard. The silhouette was unmistakable, armored, tall, and imposing, just like the others Jacob had seen on the field. "Zinther soldiers. Move." Jacob barked at Lyra and Elias, pulling her by the arm as he sprinted toward the entrance. He was moving faster than he thought possible, the fear now taking over, the instinct to protect them propelling him forward. The soldiers were closing in. Jacob could hear their heavy boots crashing through the snow, their voices shouting orders. The door to the underground shelter was only yards away now, but they weren't going to make it. Another shot rang out. This time, it was closer. "Get down," Jacob yelled, pushing Lyra and Elias down to the ground behind a snowbank. The wind whipped around them, making it harder to hear the soldiers' movements. Jacob had no time to think, no time to process what was happening. Elias motioned to the side, indicating a path through a nearby line of trees that led to another part of the shelter. Jacob nodded, recognizing the shortcut. There was no other choice now. They had to move. He stood up, pulling Lyra with him, and the three of them darted across the snow in the direction Elias had pointed. Their only hope was to outrun the soldiers and get to the shelter before they were caught. Chapter 3. The Shelter. The snow crunched beneath their boots, but the wind seemed to swallow all other sounds. Jacob could feel the cold seeping into his bones, but his focus was entirely on Lyra and Elias. They had to reach the shelter. They had to survive. Elias led the way, his movements swift and precise, every step calculated. Lyra, though weak, kept pace with them, her small form moving with a determination that Jacob couldn't help but admire. There was a fire inside her that refused to go out, no matter how many times the world tried to extinguish it. Jacob, ever on alert, glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the Zinther soldiers closing in on them. The blaster shots they had fired still rang in his ears, but he couldn't afford to look back. They had to move forward, they had to get to the shelter, and then they could figure out what to do next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the entrance to the shelter. It was hidden, tucked beneath the roots of an ancient, towering tree. The Zinther had no way of knowing it was there. Jacob had used it himself for years, a secret refuge he'd relied on when things got too dangerous. He quickly motioned for Elias and Lyra to follow him inside. The narrow passage opened into a small, well-lit room, a stark contrast to the bitter cold of the world outside. Jacob closed the entrance behind them, sealing the hatch with a quiet click. The warmth inside the shelter was immediate, a blessed relief after the icy winds of the tundra. Jacob took a deep breath, finally allowing himself to relax. They had made it. For now. He turned to Lyra, who was still standing near the back of the room, her eyes wide and darting around. The shelter, though small, was more than adequate. It had all the supplies they'd need to survive for several weeks, if not longer. "I think we're safe," Jacob said, exhaling slowly. But there was something in his gut that told him it wasn't over. The Zinther would find them, eventually. They always did. And when they did, Jacob knew the stakes would rise. Lyra sank down onto one of the cushions, her face pale but determined. "They won't stop," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet, unspoken terror. "I didn't think they would find me this quickly. But now they know I'm here. They won't let me go." Jacob's stomach clenched. He had hoped for a moment of reprieve, but Lyra's words held a weight he couldn't ignore. The Zinther would stop at nothing to capture her. And if they succeeded, Jacob had no idea what would happen next. "What do they want with you?" Elias asked, his voice calm but filled with the same unease that Jacob was feeling. He had known Elias for years. The man didn't get nervous easily, but there was something about Lyra's situation that unsettled even him. Lyra looked up at them both, her silver eyes darkening with a mixture of fear and resignation. "It's not just me they're after," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's my blood, the last of my people, the power inside me. And if they get their hands on it, it could destroy everything." The weight of her words landed heavily on Jacob's chest. He wasn't just protecting her now. He was protecting the galaxy's future. The Zinther would be relentless, but Jacob wouldn't let them take her. Not without a fight. In this continuation, Jacob, Lyra, and Elias have taken refuge in a hidden shelter, but the danger of the Zinther is far from over. The truth of Lyra's importance begins to surface, and Jacob realizes that his role in this struggle is far more significant than he ever anticipated. The stakes are rising, and the battle for survival is only beginning. The hum of the shelter's lights was a comforting sound compared to the howling winds outside. Jacob paced restlessly across the narrow room, his boots making soft taps against the cold stone floor. The warmth of the shelter had slowly seeped into his bones, and he felt the weariness of the journey beginning to settle on his shoulders. But the peace that the shelter offered felt fragile, temporary. He couldn't ignore the unease that gnawed at him. The Zinther wouldn't give up so easily. Lyra was sitting by the makeshift table in the corner of the room, her hands pressed against the surface, her eyes far away, lost in thought. Her alien features, so stark and unfamiliar, had begun to soften as she adjusted to her surroundings. But even in the dim light of the shelter, her gaze remained intense, haunted by a history she was reluctant to share. Jacob could sense the weight on her. She had already been through so much. Yet, she had remained strong, resilient. But now, Jacob knew that her survival was no longer just a personal struggle. The very fate of her people and perhaps the galaxy itself depended on what happened next. Elias, always the pragmatic one, had started organizing the supplies. He moved with purpose, but Jacob could tell his thoughts were elsewhere. The look on his face wasn't just exhaustion, it was concern. Even Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were in deeper than they had realized. "We've got supplies for at least a week," Elias said, breaking the silence as he checked the contents of their emergency packs. "But if the Zinther keep coming for her, that won't be enough." Jacob nodded, his mind still racing with unanswered questions. What did Lyra mean by the power inside me? The Zinther were hunting her, yes, but they weren't just after a girl. They were after something far more dangerous. Jacob didn't know what that power was, but Lyra's words, her cryptic warnings, hung heavily in his mind. "I'll stand guard," Jacob said, his voice firm. "We need to know how close they are. If we're going to survive this, we need to be prepared." Elias gave him a look that Jacob couldn't read. Maybe it was concern, or maybe it was something else, something Jacob couldn't put his finger on. Elias had never been one to speak openly about his doubts. He simply acted. But in that moment, Jacob could see the weight in his eyes. "We're in this together," Elias said, his voice quiet but resolute. "If we're going to protect her, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with. We can't fight blindly." Jacob nodded, agreeing with the sentiment. But the more he thought about it, the more unsettled he felt. The Zinther had found them too quickly, and they had not come here for a simple rescue mission. Lyra was carrying something far more dangerous than anyone on the planet realized. He turned back to her, finding her eyes locked onto him. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, something deeper than words could explain. "You're not alone," Jacob said to her, his voice low but filled with a sense of promise. "We'll protect you, Lyra, no matter what it takes." Her lips parted, her eyes searching his face as if weighing his words carefully, as though she had heard them before from others who hadn't kept their promises. But after a long moment, she nodded, her fragile form sinking slightly into the warmth of the shelter. "I believe you," she whispered. Jacob gave a quiet sigh of relief, the tension in his chest easing, if only for a moment. But that moment would be brief. The Zinther would be coming for her. They were relentless, and the longer they stayed hidden, the closer the confrontation would become. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. The hours stretched on, the night becoming colder as the storm outside raged. Jacob couldn't sleep. His mind was alive with possibilities, with worries, with uncertainty. The shelter had become a prison, a fragile barrier between them and the Zinther. He glanced over at Lyra, who was resting on the cot, but even in sleep, her body seemed tense, alert like a wild animal, never fully at ease. Elias was at the makeshift communications station, his eyes scanning over the data they had been able to collect. He had been trying to reach anyone who could help, any outpost or station that might still be active. But the blizzards had disabled most of their equipment, leaving them isolated in the middle of nowhere with nothing but each other and a dwindling supply of resources. Jacob moved toward the small window, his breath fogging up the glass as he stared out into the swirling snowstorm. The wind howled outside like a hungry beast, but Jacob's focus wasn't on the storm. It was on the horizon. He could feel them coming. The Zinther were out there, waiting, circling, trying to close in. He had no way of knowing how many of them there were, but their ships, their immense, imposing warships, had already been spotted overhead. They wouldn't wait much longer. "You don't have to do this," Lyra's voice broke through his thoughts. He turned toward her, his heart clenching. She had sat up, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the shelter. She was staring at him, as if seeing straight through him, her gaze filled with an intensity that made the air in the room feel charged. "I know what you're thinking," she said, her voice soft but filled with a quiet strength. "You're going to try to fight them, but you don't need to." Jacob stepped closer, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I'm not just a refugee," she said, her voice growing stronger with every word. "I'm not just someone they want to rescue. They don't just want me. They want what's inside me. The power. The last remnant of my people. The reason I'm here isn't because I'm lost. It's because I'm the key to something they need." The weight of her words hit Jacob harder than anything else could have. He had known she was important, but hearing it from her, hearing the truth of it, her words had stripped away the mystery, leaving him with the unsettling truth. The Zinther weren't hunting her out of necessity. They were hunting her for something much darker. Something that, if unleashed, could change the entire galaxy. "You're the key," Jacob whispered, the realization sinking in. "The last of your people. The last of the Salari." Lyra nodded solemnly. The Salari weren't just a species, they were a civilization that harnessed energy from the very fabric of the universe. "We could reshape entire galaxies, create new worlds. But when the war came, it destroyed everything. My people tried to keep it hidden, the technology, the power, but the Zinther they know, and they'll stop at nothing to take it from me." Jacob felt his throat tighten. He had thought he was just trying to protect a stranded survivor. He had no idea that he was sitting on the precipice of something so much larger. Lyra wasn't just a girl he had rescued from the snow. She was the last hope for her species. And her enemies weren't just aliens, they were a galactic empire with the power to shape worlds. A sharp thud broke through the tense silence as the door to the shelter rattled. The sound of boots crunching through the snow. Jacob's hand instinctively went to his blaster, but Lyra stopped him with a quiet, firm shake of her head. "No," she whispered. "They're not here to kill me. Not yet." Jacob felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" The door cracked open, just enough for a Zinther soldier to step inside. Tall, imposing, his black armor gleaming with the reflection of the firelight. The soldier's helmet was reflective, but Jacob could sense the presence behind it, the unyielding confidence of someone who knew they controlled the situation. "You have something that belongs to us," the soldier said, his voice a low growl through the modulator. "You will come with us." Lyra stood up slowly, her gaze unwavering as she faced the soldier. "I am not going with you." The soldier raised his blaster slightly, but Lyra held up a hand. A strange, almost eerie glow emanated from her skin as she gathered the power within her. Jacob felt the temperature in the room drop, a heavy force pressing down on him as the air thickened with her power. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she said quietly, her voice a whisper, but the force of it rang through the room like a thunderclap. "The power inside me isn't just a weapon. It's the key to the future of my people. If you take it from me, you will destroy everything." The soldier hesitated, his stance faltering as he seemed to reconsider the situation. "You think you can control it? I will control it," Lyra said with a cold finality. "And you won't stop me." There was a moment of stillness. Jacob could feel the tension building, the weight of Lyra's words settling over the soldier. The Zinther didn't know how to react. He had expected a surrender, an easy victory. But this alien girl, this last survivor of the Salari, wasn't just a casualty. She wasn't just running for her life. She was the universe's last hope. And for the first time, Jacob saw it clearly. Lyra wasn't just a survivor of a broken war. She was a leader, a force in her own right. And Jacob, for better or worse, was part of her fight. The Zinther soldier stepped back, his weapon lowering, but Jacob knew this was only the beginning. The power within Lyra was a double-edged sword, a weapon of unimaginable destruction or creation. He didn't know which side would win, but one thing was certain. The galaxy had just found its reckoning, and Lyra was at its center,